The Sackler family, which owns the American pharmaceutical giant Purdue, has agreed to pay the majority of an almost $12 billion settlement over its role in America's opioid crisis. As part of the deal, the family has also agreed to give up control of Purdue Pharma, which makes the highly addictive prescription painkiller OxyContin.
Now, the settlement is a huge win for US state and local governments and thousands of victims, of course, of the opioid epidemic. We're now joined by Christine Min Hee. She's a harm reduction advocate and a lawyer and the founder of opioidsettlementtracker.com. Min Hee, thank you so much. Christine, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thanks for having me.
We know that this case has been ongoing since about, I think it was 2002. Why do you think it's taken this long for a settlement to actually be reached?
Oh my gosh. I mean, when the opioid litigation in the United States began in earnest back, I would say in 2019 was when it started to heat up quite a bit. Back then, I mean, the opioid crisis, and back then it was known as an opioid crisis versus a polysubstance overdose crisis. But back then, the opioid crisis was our largest public health crisis within the nation. Since then, we've had COVID and everything after, and certainly the politicization of what we do when healthcare dollars are not being used efficiently is quite the third rail topic right now here in the US. So just the gargantuan size of the legal cases at issue, the sheer amount of permutations between plaintiff and defendant. You know, we have different classes of plaintiffs. We have state and local governments. In bankruptcy cases, we have a wider class of claimants, including individuals. We also have several different types of defendants: manufacturers of opioids, distributors of opioids, retailers, marketers, all involving different theories of liability. So each of those things had to be adjudicated in part, and a 6-year debacle this has been.
As I understand it too, this agreement still has to be approved by a New York federal bankruptcy judge and several state courts as well. And also these funds will be going to state governments. Is it right to presume then that those funds will then go to programs to help people who are addicted to opioids?
That's a theory, and that's certainly the hope, and that's the theory behind these monies being described as abatement dollars or settlement monies being used to abate future overdose crises. At the moment, I think here in the US, we're challenging this idea that just because you give a state millions of dollars, that those monies will necessarily trickle down to the communities that need them most. I think whatever faith we had in the type of so-called trickle-down economics of state-based relief efforts, we've just heard about FEMA, for instance, that type of faith has been challenged throughout COVID, where we've seen that just shipping a bunch of hospital ventilators to state government doesn't mean that those ventilators will then be used in the communities where folks are dying the fastest from COVID. So it is the hope that these monies will then be used to abate future overdose crises, which is to prevent future overdose deaths. But having this process begin now, which is, you know, in legal terms, we describe it as a sign-on process where the 15 negotiating states that have structured this new deal then try to convince the other states and localities to sign on as well. During this process, in every other opioid settlement we've seen, once we've entered this stage, it's been a matter of when versus if in terms of eventual payment. But with Purdue, you know, we really don't know what to expect with Purdue, just in general. Purdue has been anomalous since the very start of this. There's something very uniquely triggering about Purdue, and it's likely because the Sackler family, the wealthy family that owns Purdue Pharma, has taken on this type of Marie Antoinette role in the United States, where, for instance, with this new deal, the Sacklers are requesting $800 million for a separate legal fund to help insulate them from the costs of the future litigation that they're signing up for. That type of legal chicanery strikes us as let them eat cake, and let them eat cake feels like a slap in the face when so many of us are dying of preventable overdoses and the like.
Christine, there have been many documentaries, feature films, TV series even about the Sackler family and their involvement in the opioid crisis. In the aftermath of all of this, are you seeing more perhaps stringent regulation when it comes to the promotion, the marketing, the dispensing, and the prescription of these painkillers?
Certainly, there's been a slight culture shift. I think that just in general, with big pharma and the opioid crisis within the United States, it's kind of this morbid experiment. This, what happens when you apply free market capitalism to healthcare? And what we're discovering now is that the Sacklers are what happens. I've seen an increase of civil enforcement from the Federal Department of Justice against a number of the defendants involved in the opioid litigation, which for us Americans, the opioid litigation is not our federal government fighting on our behalf. It's the attorneys for each of the states suing the pharmaceutical manufacturers, distributors, retailers. And it's also the localities suing them as well. And, whether or not there's a sense of justice that emerges from this New Deal will also it's also an issue that remains to be seen. Something that I find really unique is that with this New Deal, the Sacklers are offering to pay $500 million more, which sounds ostensibly great, but they're also asking for $800 million for their own legal defense fund. So a brilliant woman out of Georgetown's O'Neill Institute, Regina LaBelle, would describe this as a type of brilliant example of the hubris that the Sacklers have displayed throughout this process. And I would add to that and say that it just shows how profoundly out of touch they are as well.